Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are sitting down together today to unpack a staggering text, and the mission for this particular deep dive is clear. We are taking a magnifying glass to Charles Spurgeon's massive commentary on Psalm 105, specifically drawing from his legendary multi-volume work, The Treasury of David. But we are not stopping with Spurgeon alone. We are bringing in the brilliant insights of various historical theologians whose notes Spurgeon curated and included alongside his own writing. To set the framework for our conversation, both of us speak from a Protestant Christian perspective, adhering to the Westminster Confession. Since you are listening to this, you likely already have a solid grasp on Reformed theology. You understand the basics of covenant theology, sovereign grace, and eternal election. So, the fascinating thing today is not that God is sovereign, but how Spurgeon and these classical commentators map that absolute sovereignty over the gritty, mundane, and, well, often brutal historical details of Israel's history. We are tracing the steps from the calling of Abraham down to the triumphant exodus from Egypt. And let me tell you, the specifics are breathtaking. We are going to look at how God uses famines like summoned workers, how the Egyptian plagues were highly targeted judgments on specific local deities, and the sheer staggering medical marvel of an entire nation leaving centuries of crushing slavery without a single sick or feeble individual among them.
Yeah, looking at this history through the lens of covenant theology gives us a distinct view of how God interacts with his chosen people. The structure of this psalm is fascinating in itself. It is the first of a series of what the commentator Christopher Wordsworth calls the Confitmini Domino Psalms. Those are the psalms that begin with the command, "O give thanks unto the Lord." There's a brilliant contrast made by some of the older commentators between Psalm 105 and Psalm 106. Psalm 106 looks at the covenant from the human side, how it was kept, or more accurately, how it was constantly broken by Israel. But this text, Psalm 105, is a meditation on the covenant as performed entirely on the part of God. It dwells on the predestinating will of God, electing individuals to holiness. Spurgeon notes right at the beginning that the first 15 verses were actually used as a hymn by King David when he was bringing the Ark of the Covenant up from the house of Obed-edom. The Ark was the physical symbol of God's presence and his covenant, making this historical recount incredibly fitting for that occasion. The narrative moves from the opening chapters of Genesis right into Exodus and Numbers, and it does so with a singular focus on divine initiative.
That focus on divine initiative really bursts out right in the first 3 verses, which lay out the duty and joy of holy conversation. The text says, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people, sing unto him, sing psalms unto him, talk ye of all his wondrous works." Spurgeon makes a fantastic observation here that hits very close to home. He points out that believers, of all people on earth, have the most amazing series of wonders to talk about. He brings this great wry humor into his notes, saying that no one would ever be blamed or labeled as a Mr. Talkative if their constant theme was the marvels of the Lord. Think about that for your own life. We love to talk about marvels. You probably like to share surprising news, break down the plot of a crazy movie, or discuss a shocking sports upset. But Spurgeon argues that if you believe in the living God, you possess an inexhaustible theme that should hold people spellbound. The acts of God in history are the most thrilling realities in the universe.
Spot on. And if we look closely at the progression of verbs in those opening verses, we see it is incredibly intentional. Give thanks, call upon his name, make known, sing, talk, glory, rejoice. It is an escalation of worship that moves from internal gratitude to public proclamation. The Scottish theologian David Dixon brings out a wonderful nuance regarding the command to sing. He says that bringing the empty vessel of our joy to God, or just singing a pleasant musical tune, falls completely short. The vessel of joy must be filled with holy matter. We must fill our joyful voices with substantive truth, with the very deeds of God. You can see this tied directly to the phrase, call upon his name. Joseph Addison Alexander clarifies that this original Hebrew phrase means to give him the descriptive title most expressive of his divine perfections. It means to call him by his name Jehovah, ascribing to him eternity, self-existence, and that specific covenant relation to his people. So the singing and the talking are rooted entirely in the objective reality of who God is and what he has decreed. It's never just an emotional exercise. It is a theological declaration.
Which translates so beautifully into verse 4, "Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his face evermore." When we think about seeking the omnipotent God, we have to connect this to your everyday life. When you feel weak, when the circumstances around you feel overwhelming, and you feel your own resources drying up, you are called to look directly to the Almighty Jehovah. You're not looking for a puny, localized deity. You are looking to omnipotence itself. You need infinite strength to bear you safely to your eternal resting place, so you must look to the strong one for it. You cannot rely on your own resolve.
What is striking about that verse is the repetition in the Hebrew text. The word seek is used 3 times. While the words differ slightly in the original Hebrew grammar, the sense is an urgent, continuous command. Seek, seek, seek. Matthew Henry provides a brilliant progression for how this works in the life of the believer. He points out that those who want strength in the inward man must fetch it from God. You cannot generate it internally. First, Henry says, you seek him for mercy. Then, having received mercy, you seek his strength for service. And finally, you seek his face for happiness. It is a progression from personal reverence to imparted strength to the conscious enjoyment of his favor. Because God is infinite, this seeking never ceases. You seek him while you live in this world, and you will have his favor in the next world, where you will be forever seeking it in an infinite progression of knowledge, yet forever satisfied in the current revelation of it.
I think we should pause on that idea of continuous seeking and how it relates to time, because this brings us to the unbreakable covenant in verses 8 through 11. The text says, "He hath remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." There is a note from John Calvin here about how time factors into God's promises. But it is one thing to say God remembers a promise after 5 years. We are talking about centuries here. How does Calvin justify the idea that a 400-year delay does not make the promise obsolete to the people actually suffering in the mud of Egypt in the meantime?
That is the crucial tension of the text. Calvin's answer is rooted in the eternal nature of God versus the chronological limitations of man. Calvin points out that a long series of years had elapsed between the initial promise made to Abraham and the actual performance of it under Moses. The world might imagine that after so many generations, the promises are extinguished or entirely forgotten. To the Israelite slave making bricks, the promise might have felt like ancient mythology. But Calvin argues that long spans of time do not make God's promises obsolete because God is outside of time. He retains his distinct memory of his decree as the day it was made, solely so he can accomplish it in his appointed season. 1,000 years is as one day to him. This is the bedrock of all his dealings with his people. He entered into a covenant, and to this covenant he remains fiercely faithful, regardless of the intervening silence. Joseph Addison Alexander notes on the phrase, "The word which he commanded, that everything God says is spoken with such absolute authority that even his promises partake of the nature of commands." It is a sovereign decree that time cannot erode.
Think about the staggering image of God making a law for himself. By giving the promise to Janub, the sovereign Lord, who is above all law and answers to no one, willingly placed himself under covenant bonds. Spurgeon calls this matchless condescension. God bound himself to act favorably toward his chosen people. Regarding the inheritance of the land of Canaan, Samuel Chandler explains the Hebrew concept of the measuring cord. The English text says the lot of your inheritance, but literally it is the measuring cord of your inheritance. It refers to the ancient method of measuring out land with a physical line. The cord becomes a symbol for the specific, decreed portion that God mapped out for his elect before they even possessed an inch of it.
Right, and that precise mapping out was completely independent of the Israelites' worldly status at the time. If we connect this to the idea of sovereign protection in verses 12 through 15, we see the extreme vulnerability of the patriarchs. The text describes them as a few men in number, yea, very few, and strangers in it. Samuel Chandler points out the literal Hebrew phrase used here, homines numeri. It essentially means they were men of number, so few they could easily be counted on your hands. They were migrating from one nation to another, moving from one kingdom to another people. They were incredibly vulnerable, effectively acting as wandering nomads with no standing army, no fortified cities, and no political alliances. Yet, they were singularly preserved in a hostile ancient Near Eastern landscape.
They really could have been wiped out completely by any of the local Canaanite warlords, but instead we read in verse 14, "He suffered no man to do them wrong, yea, he reproved kings for their sakes." There is a fascinating angle on this from Thomas Goodwin. He looks at the negative phrasing. Men cannot wrong you unless God allows it. Goodwin notes that the world often has an aching tooth against the people of God, a natural hostility toward the elect, but God puts up a definitive, invisible barrier. He points out the massive danger to kings and states that deal ill with the saints. God does not just politely ask kings to leave them alone, he violently reproves them. He brings a mighty king like Abimelech to his knees in a dream, telling him he is a dead man if he touches Abraham's wife.
That leads directly to the famous phrase in verse 15, saying, "Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm." It is vital to understand that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had no literal physical oil poured on their heads like later kings or priests. The anointing here is entirely spiritual. The theologian Malaris explains that they were called anointed because They were separated by God from the multitude of wicked men and endowed with the Holy Spirit. They were set apart for a specific redemptive purpose. They were wandering through hostile pagan territories, yet surrounded by a divine sacredness that made it absolute sacrilege for anyone to molest them. This history showcases the reliability of the covenant. The gates of hell, acting through Canaanite kings, could not prevail against those whom God separated for himself.
That idea of absolute sovereign protection in Canaan makes what happens next so jarring, because God does not just protect them in a safe bubble forever, he actively uproots them, he creates a crisis. We move into the second section of the psalm covering verses 16 through 22, which shifts the narrative to the incredible story of Joseph. The language here is stunning. Verse 16 says, "Moreover, he called for a famine upon the land. He brake the whole staff of bread." God calls for a famine. Spurgeon notes that God calls for a famine just as a master calls for a servant, and it comes at once. He breaks the staff of bread, meaning that just as a cripple falls to the ground when his physical walking staff is snapped, mankind falls when the sustenance of bread is removed.
This raises a vital point regarding the sovereignty of God over natural disasters and climate. God is not a passive observer of the weather patterns or the crop yields. The commentator A.R. Fawcett compares this to the centurion's words in the New Testament about sickness being Christ's servant, ready to come or go at his command. Famine operates the exact same way. The famine was a terrible, grim reality. It was pitiless to the weak and bitter to the strong. But it had a distinct, merciful purpose for the elect. The scarcity of food was God's specific method of leading Israel down into Egypt to incubate them as a nation. It was a severe providence, but it was a providence driven entirely by covenant love. God starves a continent to move one family to the exact location he desires.
And that severe providence extends to the agonizing details of Joseph's individual life. Verse 17 tells us, "He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant. His brothers sold him out of vicious malice, but God sent him." Spurgeon points out the incredible irony here. Joseph's free passage to Egypt was provided by the Midianite merchants. If you or I were going to send an advance guard to prepare a foreign nation for a massive famine, we would send a diplomat with money, a retinue of guards, and letters of authority. God sent a teenager as a slave, completely stripped of liberty, walking in chains straight to the auction block in a foreign slave market.
The physical descent into slavery was only the beginning of the trial. We have to look at the intense mental anguish described in verse 18, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. The commentators E.W. Hengstenberg and Andrew Jukes draw out the psychology of this imprisonment based on the Hebrew text. The literal translation of the margin reads, "Into iron came his soul." It was not just physical chains biting into his ankles, it was severe psychological trauma. They note that imprisonment brings a unique sickness of heart, a massive sense of loneliness, and a faintness of soul. It is the agony of hopes deferred. He was betrayed by his own flesh and blood, sold to strangers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife after acting righteously, and then thrown into a dungeon where he was forgotten. That is the crushing weight of isolation.
I want to make a direct connection here for you, the listener. When you feel entirely isolated, when your career has stalled out unjustly, or when you feel neglected and misunderstood by your own family or your own church, you are sharing in the exact type of trial that Joseph endured. Your soul might feel like it is laid in iron right now. The theology of that specific pain is found in verse 19. "Until the time that his word came. The word of the Lord tried him." The very promises of God, the prophetic dreams of his future destiny that God gave him as a boy, became his greatest trial while he was sitting in that dark cell.
That is a massive theological point. Edward Zuscombe, in his sermons on this passage, calls it the trial of man by the promises of God. We often think of promises as purely comforting, but the promise actually tests the metal of faith to see if it can endure the fire. Joseph had these dream visions of a mighty destiny, of ruling and blessing others. But the quietude of his father's tent in Canaan was not the preparation needed to rule an empire like Egypt. He needed a discipline that would forge a statesman capable of withstanding the intense temptations of the Egyptian court and handling a devastating national crisis. So God led him into circumstances where he was fiercely tempted to doubt those very promises. How could he rule his brothers when he was wearing the chains of a foreign prison? The word of the Lord tried him. It tested his soul against the mocking voice of unbelief and the apparent evidence of his circumstances.
God has his specific times. The text says until. You have to wait for God's until. The trial disciplines the individual right up to the very moment for the fulfillment of the promise. But when that until arrives, the reversal is staggering. Verses 20 through 22 describe it. The king sent and loosed him, even the ruler of the people, and let him go free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his substance. To bind his princes at his pleasure and teach his senators wisdom, the prisoner becomes the prime minister in a single day.
The scale of authority given to Joseph by Pharaoh is breathtaking. He was given the capability to bind his princes at his pleasure. The scholar George Phillips notes that this capability of binding is the ultimate evidence of absolute civil authority, the force of compelling obedience or inflicting punishment on the highest nobles of the land. Joseph became the absolute manager of the granaries of the known world. Even more fascinating, he became an instructor to the senators. He taught the elders of Egypt political economy, jurisprudence, morals, and divine wisdom. As the older commentator Jansenius points out, it is a brilliant spark of divine irony that the Egyptians, who always boasted that their land was the native place of human wisdom and philosophy, were forced to sit at the feet of a former Hebrew slave to learn how to survive. Jesus stands here as a flawless type of Christ, elevated from the lowest depths of humiliation to the highest throne of authority to preserve life for his people.
We move into the third section, looking at verses 23 through 27. This covers the multiplication of Israel and the mystery of the hardened heart. Verse 23 says, Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. Spurgeon uses a fantastic phrase to describe this cultural collision. He says, the dove was in the vulture's nest. Shem, the blessed, came to lodge with Ham, the accursed. Notice the text says they only sojourned there. Goshen was just a temporary lodge. It was never meant to be their permanent home. Yet while they were living in the vulture's nest, they experienced massive, unnatural growth.
Absolutely. Verse 24 tells us that God increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. This introduces a phenomenon that becomes a proverb in the history of the church. The church flourishes under oppression. The Egyptian court recognized the demographic threat and tried to retard their increase by implementing tyrannical measures, forced labor, infanticide, brutal conditions. But the exact opposite of their goal took place. The physical strength and the sheer numbers of the Israelites grew exponentially precisely when they were being crushed under the heaviest loads. It demonstrates the absolute futility of contending with the decrees of God. The more the world tries to extinguish the elect, the more they multiply.
Now, we need to pause here because verse 25 raises a heavy question for anyone reading this text carefully. It says, he turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants. If God turned the hearts of the Egyptians to hate the Israelites, is God the author of their sin? How do we understand this through a reformed Westminster framework without making God culpable for the wicked actions of the Egyptians?
This is a crucial theological segment, and we must handle it with absolute precision. The theologians Matthew Poole and John Calvin provide excellent scholastic distinctions here. God is unequivocally not the author of sin. He did not take wicked hatred and inject it into the pure, neutral hearts of the Egyptians. That would violate the absolute holiness of God's nature. Furthermore, as Poole points out, it was completely unnecessary to inject evil into them, because fallen human nature already has that wickedness inherent within it. Instead, God turned their hearts by withdrawing the common gifts and restraints of his Spirit. He removed the hindrances, leaving the Egyptians entirely to their own corrupt affections, their racial prejudice, and their political paranoia. Furthermore, God governed that existing hatred so that it fell upon the Israelites at that specific time, accomplishing his decree to make Israel uncomfortable in Egypt. If the Egyptians had treated them well forever, Israel would never have wanted to leave for the Promised Land.
Spurgeon uses a brilliant analogy to make this abstract theology concrete for you. He asks, is the sun to blame because its heat hardens clay while softening wax? Does the sun create the foul smell of the swamp? No. The sun just shines. If the sun shone on a bed of roses, it would draw forth fragrance. The foulness is already in the swamp. The hardness is already in the nature of the clay. The evil is entirely within human nature. The sovereignty of turning that evil to useful covenantal purposes belongs entirely to the Lord. The Egyptians used satanic policy to try to crush Israel, but God used their very hatred to sever the emotional ties between Israel and Egypt, setting the stage for the Exodus.
Which leads directly to the sent deliverers in verses 26 and 27. He sent Moses his servant, and Aaron whom he had chosen. They showed his signs among them, and wonders in the land of Ham. Once the oppression reached its absolute peak, and the cry of the people went up, God had the men in readiness. He thrust them forward. John Trapp makes a lovely note here about God usually sending his servants 2 by 2 for mutual comfort and strength. Moses and Aaron differed significantly in their gifts. Moses was the reluctant leader with heavy administrative burdens, while Aaron was the eloquent speaker. Together, they made the perfect supplement to one another. They were clothed with divine might, standing before the most powerful monarch on earth to execute judgment.
That brings us to section 4, where the historical narrative explodes into the plagues. Verses 28 through 36 describe these judgments. But before we look at the specific horrors that fell on Egypt, how should we understand the nature of the plagues themselves? They were not just random natural disasters dialed up to 11, right?
Spot on. The marginal reading of the Hebrew in verse 27 is incredibly helpful here. It calls the plagues words of his signs. They were speaking marvels. They were not arbitrary magic tricks meant simply to terrify. They were distinct, pointed discourses testifying to Jehovah's omnipotence. Crucially, they were targeted, surgical judgments on the specific idolatry of Egypt. The Egyptian pantheon was vast, and they believed their gods controlled every aspect of the natural world. These plagues were designed to pour absolute scorn on the proudest nation on earth, systematically dismantling their theology piece by piece and proving that Jehovah is the Lord of all creation.
Let us walk through them. Verse 28 starts with the plague of thick darkness. He sent darkness and made it dark, and they rebelled not against his word. This was not a normal sandstorm or a heavy solar eclipse. This is a thick, palpable obscurity that lasted 3 full days. The text in Exodus says no one dared to move from their seat. Imagine that level of paralyzing terror. You are sitting in your house, and the darkness is so thick you cannot see the person sitting next to you, and you are too terrified to even stand up. The historical context provided by Thomas Millington brings this vividly to life. The Egyptians were fervent worshippers of the sun god Osiris or Ra, depending on the era and specific cult. The pharaoh himself was considered the literal representative of the sun, entitled to divine honors, and seen as the source of light and life for the empire. By blotting out the sun for 3 days with a darkness that could be felt, Jehovah plunged their chief deity into total impotence and chaos. It was a direct strike at the pinnacle of their pantheon. Millington mentions a chilling Jewish rabbinical tradition regarding this specific plague. The tradition suggests that evil spirits were let loose during these 3 days of palpable darkness. Because the Egyptians were glued to their seats in terror, unable to see anything, the darkness was filled with hideous shrieks and apparitions, driving them almost to madness. It was a terrifying foretaste of ultimate eternal judgment.
That is genuinely terrifying. From the sky, God moves to the water. Verse 29 says, He turned their waters into blood and slew their fish. The beloved sweet waters of the Nile turned into a putrid crimson flood. We have to contrast this with the natural annual reddening of the Nile because skeptics love to say this is just a red algae bloom.
Right, the scholar James G. Murphy outlines the absolute distinction between the miracle and the natural phenomena. The Nile does naturally assume a reddish, turbid hue late in the summer due to red earth washing down from the mountains. But that natural change brings fertility and does not harm the wildlife. This miracle, however, occurred instantly at the word of Moses. It killed the fish, which were a massive food supply for the populace, and in some cases, certain fish were considered sacred animals themselves. The river stank horribly, making it undrinkable. Furthermore, the stroke was arrested exactly at 7 days by divine command, whereas the natural redness lasts for weeks. The Nile was the absolute benefactor of the country. It was revered as a god itself, named Hapi, and seen as the bloodstream of Osiris. Turning it to literal blood was a devastating blow to their economy, their physical survival, and their core religion.
Then comes the plague of frogs in verse 30. Their land brought forth frogs in abundance in the chambers of their kings. They invaded the royal bedchambers. The commentator Josiah Shute points out something fascinating here. Earthly princes are usually completely exempt from human reproof. You cannot just walk into a royal palace and criticize a dictator. They are insulated by guards, walls, and protocol. But God's judgments penetrate their greatest privacy. The frogs swarmed past the royal guards into the most select, guarded apartments of the pharaoh, getting into his bed and his ovens.
We must also remember the religious context. The Egyptians actually had a frog-headed goddess named Heki, whose very domain was supposed to be fertility and the protection of childbirth. To kill a frog was a crime. So the multiplication of these creatures until they became a loathsome, suffocating, rotting nuisance was a brilliant mockery of that specific deity. Their own god became their tormentor, and they were forbidden by their own religion from killing them. This theme of absolute, inescapable defilement continues in verse 31. He spake, and there came divers sorts of flies and lice in all their coasts.
I cannot imagine the psychological horror of the lice. The text says they were in all their coasts, turning the very dust of the earth into biting insects.
The meanest beggars on the street were more approachable than the proud Egyptian nobility during this plague. The ancient historian Herodotus notes that Egyptian priests shaved their entire bodies every other day to remain absolutely pure for their gods. They wore only linen, avoiding wool so as not to harbor any insects.
That historical detail shows why the lice were such a catastrophic judgment. This foul vermin defiled the priests physically, making all their religious rites completely impossible. They could not minister before their deities while covered in parasites. Furthermore, the sacred animals, the apis bulls, the cats, the ibises, were also covered in lice. It was an unparalleled slap in the face to human pride and ritual purity. Pharaoh and his pristine priests were reduced to the most disgusting state of filthiness, scratching uncontrollably. As Spurgeon Riley notes, what incredible armies the Lord can send forth when he fights, not with majestic angels, but with tiny lice. It shows his absolute contempt for human arrogance.
From the crawling insects, God moves back to the weather. Verses 32 and 33 say, "He gave them hail for rain and flaming fire in their land. He smote their vines also and their fig trees, and brake the trees of their coasts." This was not just a heavy thunderstorm. The text in Exodus describes lightning running along the ground in fiery flakes. The hailstones shattered the trees and destroyed all the flax and barley crops.
Dionysius Lardner recounts historical observations of severe hailstorms to give us a sense of the sheer physical devastation. He notes storms in Europe where hailstones weighed nearly a pound, and ancient records of stones far larger, capable of killing livestock and men instantly. When a hurricane of that magnitude hits an agrarian society, breaking the massive trees and smashing the vines to splinters, it completely eradicates their hope for future harvests. God was systematically breaking the agricultural infrastructure of the empire, proving that their weather gods like Nut and Seth were entirely powerless.
Whatever the hail left standing, the locusts finished off. Verses 34 and 35 read, "He spake, and the locusts came, and caterpillars, and that without number, and did eat up all the herbs in their land, and devoured the fruit of their ground." The scale of these swarms is almost impossible to comprehend for someone living in a modern city.
Historical observers give us a glimpse of this terror. The commentator M. Kalish mentions a relatively modern swarm in India that cast a solid shadow over 40 square miles. He notes another column in the Maratha country that was 500 miles long, completely hiding the sun like a dense eclipse. John Burrow notes that when locusts pass through a region, they devour every single green thing. They even climb trees to strip the bark down to the bare wood, leaving the ground looking as though a heavy broom had swept it clean of life. Commissioned by God, these insect armies leaped forward at a single word, leaving behind nothing but a desolate, starving wasteland.
Which brings us to the master blow. Verse 36 says, "He smote also all the firstborn in their land, the chief of all their strength." The midnight cry in Egypt, the flower of the nation, from the absolute pinnacle of the palace down to the miserable slave at the grinding mill, was cut off in a single night. There was not a house where there was not one dead.
The divine justice displayed here is terrifyingly exacting. James Hamilton describes the scene vividly, the unearthly shrieks echoing in the dark as doors burst open, the king's messengers rushing frantically through the streets, the horrifying realization in the palace that the royal prince, the heir to the throne and a supposed god himself, is dead. Pharaoh had decreed the death of the Hebrew male children in the river. He had relentlessly smitten Israel, whom God explicitly called his own firstborn son. Now the Lord repaid him to his face. It was the absolute crushing defeat of the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian state, breaking Pharaoh's will entirely and forcing them to thrust the Israelites out of the land.
That launches us into section 5, covering the triumphant exodus and the wilderness provision. Verse 37 says, "He brought them forth also with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes. They did not leave empty-handed, sneaking out like fleeing fugitives in the night. They brought out the wealth of the empire. It was a just recompense for generations of unpaid, forced brickmaking. The Egyptians were so terrified of dying that they gladly handed over their jewels, their gold, and their silver just to get the Israelites to leave."
The transfer of wealth is amazing, but the physical wealth is entirely secondary to the stunning medical miracle recorded in the second half of that verse. It says there was not one feeble person among their tribes. The Hebrew word for feeble person denotes a totterer or a stumbler, someone physically unfit for service. Out of a population of perhaps 2 million people who had just endured brutal slavery, malnutrition, and beatings, not a single one limped. Not one had to be carried on a stretcher. Matthew Henry points out that they carried none of the diseases of Egypt with them into the desert. Jehovah Rophi, the Lord who heals, healed them entirely for the rigorous trek ahead. When God calls his people to a long, arduous march, he equips them for it physically and spiritually. It is a stunning testimony to his comprehensive care.
He guides them continuously through the harsh terrain. Verse 39 says, He spread a cloud for a covering and fire to give light in the night. Think about the practical grace of this in a desert environment. The pillar of cloud acted as a massive royal canopy, shielding the entire camp from the brutal, scorching Middle Eastern sun. At night, when the desert temperature plummets, the fire acted as their central heating and streetlights, illuminating their massive town of tents better than modern cities.
We can connect this directly to God's continuous, varying provision for you today. The cloud and the fire represent the dual nature of God's care in our lives. He provides shade for times of scorching prosperity, keeping you from being burned or blinded by your own success and comfort. Conversely, he provides a brilliant, burning light for times of dark adversity, guiding your steps and warming your soul when everything around you is pitch black and freezing. He's your sun and your shield, constantly adapting his manifest presence to exactly what your current circumstances require.
The provisions in the desert are laid out further in verses 40 and 41. The people asked, and he brought quails, and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. He opened the rock, and the waters gushed out. They ran in the dry places like a river. There is a massive theological difference between the giving of the quails and the giving of the manna.
The text reveals a complex mixture of judgment and goodness. The quails were given in anger. The people asked wickedly, murmuring against God and driven by a base lust for meat, remembering the flesh pots of Egypt. God gave them what they asked for, but it became a severe discipline, sending a plague among them while the meat was still in their teeth. The manna, however, is described as the bread of heaven, given in pure, sustaining love. It was an unmingled good that truly satisfied their daily needs without breeding greed.
The water from the rock is such a beautiful, striking image. God did not just make the rock drip enough for a few people to catch water in a cup. He cleft it violently, and the waters gushed out, running through the dry desert valleys like a literal river. It flowed on continuously so that those at a distance could stoop down and drink their fill alongside their livestock.
This brings us to a beautiful piece of biblical typology. The commentator James Bennett frames the smitten rock as a profound type of the person of Jesus Christ. The physical rock at Horeb was firm, immovable, yet visually unappealing, just as Isaiah says Christ had no beauty that we should desire him. Crucially, the rock was smitten by the rod of Moses, which represents the rod of the law, just as Christ bore the punishing strike of divine justice under the law. Out of that violent smiting poured a pure, abundant, perpetual stream of grace for thirsty sinners, a river running through the dry, arid places of this fallen world to give life to anyone who drinks.
What was the goal of all this? Why the plagues, the parting of the sea, the manna, the water from the rock? We find the answer in the concluding verses, 44 and 45. God gave them the lands of the heathen, and they inherited the labor of the people, that they might observe his statutes and keep his laws. They inherited a fully cultivated land without having to work for it. They moved into stone houses they did not build, drank from wells they did not dig, and ate from vineyards they did not plant.
The precise design of all this sovereign grace is stated right there at the end, that they might observe his statutes. The entire apparatus of redemption, the terrifying miracles in Egypt, the miraculous provision in the desert, the supernatural protection against kings was meant to produce a holy nation. The high calling and the glorious election of Israel were intended to make them the conservator of divine truth in a pagan world, an exemplar of morality and a pattern of devotion. God's grace was poured out in staggering measure so that they would be equipped and obligated to live completely for his glory. Election is never just about being saved from something, it is about being saved for something, specifically holy obedience.
What a summary of history. We have covered massive ground today. We traced a solitary, seemingly fragile promise made to an obscure family wandering in Canaan, through the dark iron fetters of Joseph's dungeon, all the way to the utter devastation of the greatest empire on earth, and finally into a miraculous desert exodus. Every single step, even the agonizing delays, was orchestrated by the sovereign decree of God.
It showcases the absolute steadfast reliability of the covenant. God governs the rise and fall of massive nations, the turning of the weather, the swarming of the insects of the field, and the paranoid hearts of kings, all to preserve his elect and fulfill his promises.
To wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, specifically regarding Psalm 105, verse 5, which commands us, remember his marvelous works. Up until now, we have discussed the grand sweep of redemptive history. Consider the actual mechanics of human memory in your own life. If the sovereign God of the universe uses the rise and fall of ancient global empires just to keep a single promise to an obscure family, how does that alter the way you view the confusing, chaotic global headlines of today? Even more, how does it reframe that seemingly random, silent, or painful trial currently sitting in your own living room? If God's memory of his covenant directs the entire cosmos, your act of remembering that truth might just be the most potent weapon you have against despair. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking. Keep reading, keep thinking, and keep seeking the Lord's strength.